The next multiple lectures are going to revolve around the respiratory system, including multiple lectures within Chapter 16 and then multiple lectures within Chapter 17. What we're going to start off with, though, with regard to the respiratory system, is something that's called pulmonary ventilation. So what is pulmonary ventilation? Pulmonary ventilation seems like a simple process, but it's actually quite complicated. Okay, so on its surface, pulmonary ventilation is really breathing. It's, first of all, bringing air from the atmosphere into our lungs, a process that's called inhalation, inhaling air. Okay? And then pulmonary ventilation also involves bringing air from our lungs back out into the atmosphere, a process that's called exhalation or exhaling air. So pulmonary ventilation is really breathing, right? It's inhaling, bringing air from the atmosphere into our lungs, and exhaling, bringing air from our lungs back out into the atmosphere. That is what is listed at the very top right there. Pulmonary ventilation, right? It's breathing. Air from the atmosphere into the lungs, inhaling, air from the lungs back out into the atmosphere, exhaling. What we're going to do is talk through that process in detail because it's far more complicated than I think you would ever believe. It seems really simple, right? It just seems like we would just suck air in and then blow it back off, but it is far more sophisticated than that. It's all due to changes in pressure gradients that influence the movement of air from one place to the next. So that's what we're going to focus on. It's going to take us a decent amount of time to be able to get through the entire thing. And then after we're done talking about pulmonary ventilation, we'll move to the next thing, which is the point of pulmonary ventilation, which is to allow for a continual process of what's called gas exchange. The point of bringing air from the atmosphere into our lungs, called inhaling air, is to actually bring oxygen from the atmosphere into our lungs so that the oxygen within the air can be exchanged with the blood, meaning the oxygen that is now within the lungs can go into the bloodstream. Okay, that's the point of inhaling. Now, what's the point of exhaling? Like, what's the point of taking air from the lungs and blowing it off into the atmosphere? Well, the answer is, well, because carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, actually travels around in your bloodstream, and the CO2, the carbon dioxide, actually goes into your lungs. It's exchanged with your lungs, as it's called, right? And that carbon dioxide that travels from your blood into your lungs, we blow it off into the atmosphere. That's part of pulmonary ventilation, when we blow the air back out. So, exhaling air. What's the point of exhaling air, blowing air off? Well, it's to actually blow the carbon dioxide within your lungs that came from your bloodstream off into the atmosphere, right? So this is gas exchange. It's the exchange, basically, of oxygen within the air in your lungs into your bloodstream and carbon dioxide within your blood into your lungs, okay? And if you didn't have pulmonary ventilation, the process of breathing, then the gas exchange, I can't explain this right now, but if it weren't for pulmonary ventilation, gas exchange would eventually just stop. It wouldn't be able to happen. So again, this is a step-by-step process. Gas exchange, the whole idea of it, will make more sense after we finish discussing pulmonary ventilation, which is what we need to do right now. So to begin the process of explaining how air gets in and out of the lungs, called pulmonary ventilation, we're going to watch the path that air takes as it moves from the atmosphere all the way down into your lungs. This is almost just it is a mild lesson in anatomy. And you might say, why do I need to know the anatomy of the lungs to be able to understand how air gets in and out of the lungs? I think that is fairly logical, because the anatomical organization is going to explain everything to us in terms of how the lungs are actually going to function to allow for this process of pulmonary ventilation to occur. You have to understand the anatomical organization of the lungs to be able to understand ultimately how the lungs function to get air in and out of them. So again, we're going to look at the process, the actual process that air takes as it moves from the atmosphere all the way down into your lungs. So most humans breathe through their nose, first of all. That doesn't mean we can't breathe through our mouth, because we do, but it's much more common and standard to breathe through the nose. And what happens with that process? Air moves from the atmosphere through what are called your nares, right? Your nostrils, the openings of the nose. So air moves from the atmosphere through the nares into your nasal cavity. Okay. Your nasal cavity has all of these almost like bat wing shaped structures within it that causes the air that comes into it to move in a very turbulent fashion. And also in your nasal cavity, there's a whole bunch of mucus. And since the air moves nicely, and not nicely, since the air moves through the nasal cavity in this very turbulent fashion, it allows a lot of the bacteria, viruses, other pollutants to get trapped by the mucus that's in your nasal cavity. Okay, that's a little bit beyond what we need to be talking about right now, but if you were wondering what these conchae are, what's the purpose of them, those kind of bat-shaped bony structures in the nasal cavity, that's the purpose. It's to cause the air to move in a very turbulent fashion, and as it moves in that turbulent fashion, a lot of mucus traps bad stuff that is out in the air, and then that leads into a whole other anatomical conversation, right? You can either blow the mucus out, or you end up swallowing it, and it travels down your esophagus into your stomach, where all the acid destroys the bacteria and the viruses. So I will stop talking about that any further. Anyways, air moves from the atmosphere through your nostrils, right, through the nares, into your nasal cavity, and then the air moves from the nasal cavity into collectively what's referred to as the pharynx. The pharynx is the anatomical term for your throat. Now, there's more to the throat than just the pharynx, but the pharynx is kind of the upper part of the throat anyways. So, okay. So the air is now within the pharynx, or the upper part of the throat. And then where does the air go from the pharynx, or the upper part of the throat? Here we go, right? There's the air moving from the atmosphere through the nares into the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, the upper part of the throat, through the pharynx, and then the air would technically have two different options. Okay? When the air is at the bottom of the pharynx, again, the kind of upper part of the throat, it could technically go in two different directions. It could either go down the esophagus, which leads to the stomach, or it could go through what's called the larynx, or the voice box, down into the trachea, also known as your windpipe. So I think logically, we all know what's going to happen, right? We don't want air going down into our esophagus and then down into our stomach, right? We want air to move from the pharynx, the upper part of the throat, into our windpipe, which is called our trachea. Okay? And the way that it's going to do that is it's going to travel first through the larynx. The larynx is referred to, in more layman's terms, as the voice box. Some people refer to the larynx as being the second part of the throat, technically, as well. Kind of the bottom part of the throat. So we're not to the point of discussing this, but there's got to be something that would cause the air to diverge in that direction, right? I mean, because it's a fork. The air could go down into the esophagus, right, from the pharynx, or the air could go down into the windpipe or the trachea. Why does the air travel down into the trachea and not the esophagus, right? That should immediately tell you this whole process is far more complicated than one would think. Okay? There's got to be something pulling air in that direction, towards the windpipe or the trachea and away from the esophagus. And there absolutely is. There are these big pressure gradients that exist that pull the air in particular directions. Okay? We're not to that point. I just wanted to point it out because I think it's logical to discuss it right now. I mean, just to make a point that there's got to be some explanation as to why air would choose to move in this direction. Okay, and we'll get to that. But let's first of all look at the larynx and then continue on talking about the path that air takes through the lungs and then talk about the actual physiological explanation for why it does this. So this is a view of the larynx, an anterior view. That right there is the larynx, the voice box. Okay, down here is the trachea. You can always tell by these rings of cartilage that you're looking at the trachea or the windpipe. Trachea, windpipe means the exact same thing. Okay? Anyways, the larynx or the voice box. What part of the larynx are we looking at? We're looking at an anterior view. You'd be looking straight on at the larynx. How do you know that? Well, this is what's called the laryngeal prominence, also known as the Adam's apple. And if you're looking straight at the laryngeal prominence or the Adam's apple, you know that you're looking at the front or anterior view of the larynx. Okay. Now, what we're actually interested in is what's called the superior view. You would have to look over and into the larynx to see what we're actually interested in. This is what's called a superior view in anatomy. Imagine taking the larynx, looking over the top of it and inside of it. Okay, and let's take a look at it and try to explain what I'm saying a little more. So this is a superior view of the larynx itself. Okay, if you were to take that previous image that we just looked at and you were to look over the top of the larynx and into it, this right here is what you would see. Okay. This is another way of thinking about it. This is kind of the passageway into the larynx, right? When the air is traveling from the pharynx, the upper part of the throat, and it reaches the fork, meaning the air can either travel down into the larynx or it could travel down into the esophagus. This would be the passageway that air would have to take to get into the larynx, right? This is the superior view of the larynx. If the air wants to get down into the larynx and down into the trachea ultimately, this is what the air has to travel through. And you'll notice that by looking at this superior view of the larynx, to get in to the larynx, there are two what are called vocal cords. The vocal cords are really like two pieces of connective tissue, like flaps of connective tissue that almost serve as a door into and out of the larynx. Okay. The opening that exists, that can exist in the center of the two vocal cords. Okay. If you talk about that opening in the center, plus the two vocal cords, they're called true vocal cords, but again, this isn't anatomy, so I'm trying not to overdo it. The opening in the center between the two vocal cords plus the two vocal cords is referred to as the glottis. Okay. The glottis is, again, anatomically made up of the two vocal cords, what are called true vocal cords, plus the opening that exists in the center. Sometimes that opening is open, and sometimes that opening is closed. Again, the vocal cords can kind of function like a door. They can either open up or they can close, and they also have the ability to flap and make sound ultimately, which is what we think about as somebody's voice. What I'm trying to get to, though, is what happens is that air moves from the pharynx, the upper part of the throat, through the glottis. Let's change the color. How about green? Through the glottis down into the larynx. Right? The glottis is technically part of the larynx, but the air moves through the glottis and then into what's the bulk of what we think about as the larynx. The glottis is kind of the passageway for air into, ultimately, the larynx and down into the trachea. Now, let's go back and look at a different image. So this shows exactly what I've been talking about. Air is going to move from the atmosphere through the nares into the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, right? From the nasal cavity into the pharynx, the upper part of the throat. And then the air within the pharynx has one of two options, right? It could either go down the esophagus or it could travel through the larynx down into the trachea. And we know that that's exactly what happens. What this image is showing you right there is the glottis, right? The glottis is part of the larynx, and the glottis makes up the two vocal cords plus the opening in the center. And the air ultimately travels through the glottis into the bulk of the larynx, and then down into the trachea, also known as the windpipe, right? So this is the path that air takes, because now we're really starting to get into the lungs, because the trachea is ultimately going to lead down into the left and right lung. So by the time that we've gotten air through the glottis down into the trachea, we're getting real close to the lungs. So this is a more detailed image of the same thing. Air is going to move from the atmosphere through the nares into the nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity, the air is going to move into the pharynx, the upper part of the throat. And then the air is going to travel through the pharynx and it's going to get to the fork, right? Air can either then travel down into the esophagus, or the air can move anteriorly through the glottis of the larynx, which is depicted right there, and into the larynx, down into the trachea or windpipe. And that's exactly the path that air takes. Now, I just can't stop myself from saying this. So, everybody's going to hear the word vocal cord, and you're going to think, well, how does the vocal cord ultimately make sounds and thus our voice? That's how I'm communicating with you right now. It's actually because my vocal cords are vibrating, and that's creating sound waves that you're hearing as my voice, and thus you are then interpreting what I'm saying as a language and allowing you to understand through that interpretation of language what I'm saying. Okay, so unbelievably complicated and amazing. But where's the sound? Where's my voice coming from? Okay, the answer is, well, that's through the process of air going out, right? Exhalation. Okay, when we blow air out of our lungs, as we're going to look at as this lecture progresses, sometimes when we blow air out, what happens is the air, to get out, has to travel through the glottis as well. Clearly, right? Air is going to move from the trachea, and it's going to move from the trachea into the larynx, and then it's going to have to move through the glottis back into the pharynx, and then the air can either go out of the mouth or out of the nose. So when we're exhaling, if we want to create sound, which again is our voice, what happens is there are some muscles of the larynx that will contract and change the shape of the actual orientation of the vocal cords. And as the air is traveling out of the glottis, it travels past the vocal cords, and it causes the vocal cords to vibrate, sound waves. And then that creates sound. Again, and that sound we manipulate to create different pitches. I'm no musician, but we based upon the frequency by which the vocal cords vibrate and other components of their vibration, how they're shaped when they vibrate, that will create different types of sounds, which are different words that, again, people interpret as a language. Now, every time that we exhale, we don't create sound, right? We don't always, every single time that we exhale, we don't create words. Doesn't have to be words. We just, every time that we exhale, we don't create meaningful amounts of sound. So in what instances when we exhale are we actually creating this sound that can be created by humans and other animals? And that's a really complicated conversation, but when you want to create sound, through consciousness, these laryngeal muscles, as they're called, the muscles of the larynx, we consciously contract them when we're exhaling, and that changes the shape of the vocal cords. And we also breathe out a little bit more forcefully when we're creating sound. And that change in the shape of the vocal cords plus that more forceful air traveling past the vocal cords causes them to vibrate and create these different sounds. So speaking is a very conscious process, as I think all of you are very well aware of. There's a whole component of the cerebral cortex which is dedicated to speech. But I won't get any further into that. I just wanted to point out how it's possible for where the vocal cords really get their name. Okay, vocal cords, they create sound, which other people and ourselves interpret as speech and language. And they do it through vibration, which creates sound waves. Okay? And that vibration happens because of air traveling past them when we're exhaling. By the way, if you don't believe me that air is made through the process of exhaling, right, blowing air out of the lungs, all you have to do is put your hand in front of your face. Okay, in front of your mouth, I should say. Put your hand in front of your mouth and then start to talk loudly. And as you do that, you'll feel air, as you're talking loudly, you'll feel air blowing against your hand. Okay? That should tell you what's happening here, right? In order for you to be able to talk, what's happening is air is actually moving through your trachea and then through the glottis, right? And as the air travels through the glottis, as you're exhaling, that air causes the vocal cords to vibrate, which creates sound. But that air that's traveling through the glottis and enabling those vocal cords to vibrate and create sound has to go somewhere, and it gets blown out of your mouth. And you can feel that right on your hand. Now, as I said, much of the time when we exhale air, we don't cause the vocal cords to vibrate to any meaningful degree, and we don't create any meaningful sound. But that all comes down to whether these laryngeal muscles, how they're contracted or if they're contracted when exhalation is happening, and thus what their orientation is and how forceful the air is that's coming out. So sound creation and speech, right? It's an incredibly complicated and sophisticated process, but hopefully you have it, if for those of you that haven't taken anatomy, maybe you have a little bit better of an idea of where it comes from. Back to the actual point of this conversation, which was talking about how air gets from the atmosphere into our lungs. Okay, air again travels through the nares into the nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity, it enters into the pharynx or the upper part of the throat. From the pharynx, it travels anteriorly through the glottis into the bulk of the larynx and now down into the trachea or the windpipe. So by getting ultimately that air past the glottis into the larynx, the bulk of the larynx, now we get down into the actual trachea or the windpipe. And now the air keeps traveling down the trachea until it gets to the bottom or terminal part of the trachea. And then what happens is the trachea bifurcates, right? It splits. And the trachea is going to split into what's called a left and right primary bronchi, right? They're going to, that's plural, there's two of them. right? There's what's called the left and right primary bronchi. And by the time that the trachea has split into either the left primary bronchus, right, singular, if by the time that the trachea has split either into the, let's erase this, left primary bronchus or right primary bronchus, you are now within what's called the left or right lung. The left and right primary bronchi are functionally part of the lungs. So clearly we need to take a little closer look at those two things. This is an image of the left primary bronchus. Okay. Over here is the right primary bronchus. If you talk about both of them together, they are the primary bronchi, right? The left primary bronchus goes into the left lung. The right primary bronchus goes into and becomes part of the right lung. Anyways, both of these primary bronchi are going to branch, okay? And when either of the primary bronchi branch, they form what are known as secondary bronchi, okay? The left primary bronchus is going to branch into what are called two secondary bronchi, right? And we'll talk about this in a second, but the right primary bronchus is going to branch actually into three secondary bronchi. Now, why? So each secondary bronchi is going to go to one lobe of the lung. Okay, so that tells us something obvious about the left and right lung. If in the left lung, the left primary bronchus branches into two secondary bronchi, and each secondary bronchus goes to one lobe, then that tells us that the left lung has two lobes, right? There are two secondary bronchi, and each secondary bronchus goes to a specific lobe, right? And then on the right side, so what does that tell us about the right lung? If on the right side, the right primary bronchus branches into three secondary bronchi, that tells us that the right lung has three lobes. And you can look at this image and you can very easily see that that must be true because the left lung is smaller, right? The left lung is smaller than the right lung. There are two lobes within your left lung and there are three lobes within your right lung. Now, why is that the case? Well, look at the left lung. It has within it what's called the cardiac notch. There's an actual space that's made within the left lung for the heart to sit and exist. And by consequence, that cardiac notch makes the left lung smaller. The heart sits slightly on the left side of your body, and the apex is also angled. A little bit of a technical difficulty there, but the apex is also slightly angled towards the left leg as well. So generally speaking, the heart just lies slightly to the left in the thoracic cavity. And thus the left lung is the one that has to make space for the heart. And thus the left lung is smaller than the right lung. And thus the left lung has two lobes while the right lung has three lobes. Okay, I won't go any further into the anatomy, but at a minimum, I at least wanted to point that out. So in the right lung, there are two secondary bronchi. In the right lung, there are three. What's going to happen next? Well, you can imagine they're just going to keep splitting, right? They're just going to keep branching. And every single time that a secondary bronchus, right, maybe like this one right here, that's a secondary bronchus. Every single time that a secondary bronchus branches, it branches into what's called a tertiary bronchus. And what I can tell you is that between, let's just focus on the left lung for now, each one of these secondary bronchi is going to branch into about 5 tertiary bronchi. Again, each secondary bronchi, there are 2 of them. Each one of them is going to branch into about 5 tertiary bronchi. So what does that tell us about the left lung? It tells us about the left lung that there are approximately 10 tertiary bronchi. Because if each secondary bronchi branches into about 5 tertiary bronchi, right, that equates to approximately 10 tertiary bronchi total. And that actually ends up being about the same within the right lung. There are 10, maybe 11 total tertiary bronchi. It varies a little bit from person to person. But there actually ends up being about 10 tertiary bronchi within the left and the right lung. Sometimes a few more within the right lung. It's not one of those things that's universal from one person to the next. Like every normal person, healthy person, I shouldn't say normal, but every healthy person has 4 chambers of the heart. Okay, it would be very difficult to live if you ended up with I don't know if there are. I'm sure that there are defects where people end up with more or less chambers, but I'm not sure that they would end up ultimately surviving. I would need to look into that. So, anyways, most living human beings have 4 chambers within their heart. Okay. That's really not always the case when it comes to looking at the lungs. Like some people, one person to the next, some people will have 10, 11, 12 tertiary bronchi. It just varies a little bit from one person to the next. It's not terribly consistent from one human to the next human being. It is generally true that if there's going to be more tertiary bronchi on one side versus the other, the right lung will tend to have a few more tertiary bronchi than the left lung for obvious reasons. Okay, anyways, let's keep going. What's going to happen now to the tertiary bronchi? The tertiary bronchi are just going to keep branching. They're just going to keep branching and branching and branching and branching and branching. And beyond the tertiary bronchi, they really stop being named anything. Okay, they just call them smaller bronchi in your text. There are at least 24 orders of branching. Okay, so primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, that's 3 orders of branching. And we think that continues on for at least 24 more orders. So rather than continue to name them and say how many exist within each order, that becomes, even more inconsistent from one person to the next. Instead of doing that, we just say smaller bronchi. And now we do eventually get to the point where we start naming them again. Okay? And it all deals with what is the inner diameter of the actual tube itself. So, as the bronchi keep branching, they just become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? It's just like blood vessels. As arteries move further and further away from the heart, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, as these bronchi keep moving further and further away from the trachea, and the bronchi keep branching and branching and branching, they just become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, the bronchi, when their internal diameter is between 0.5 and 1 millimeter, which is very small, they get called bronchioles. Bronchioles, by definition, are these tubes within the lungs. They're bronchi that exist within the lungs that have inner diameters of 0.5 to 1 millimeter, right? They're very, very small. And then the bronchioles will actually keep branching, to even further orders. And when the bronchioles keep branching, they keep becoming smaller. And as they continue to become smaller, they'll eventually become what are called terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles are branches of bronchioles that have internal diameters of less than 0.5 millimeters, right? They're incredibly small. And this is ultimately where air ends up. Air travels down the trachea, and if we're looking at the left side here, right, air is going to travel from the trachea into the left primary bronchus, and then into the secondary bronchi, then into the 10 different tertiary bronchi, and then all of the smaller bronchi that branch off of the tertiary bronchi, and then the smaller bronchi are just going to keep branching and branching and branching until they eventually become bronchioles, which have internal diameters between 0.5 and 1 millimeter, excuse me. And then the bronchioles keep branching and eventually become terminal bronchioles. Okay? And air is just going to travel through all of these tubes. Right? And this entire passageway from the trachea all the way down into even the terminal bronchioles is what's called the conducting zone. All of these tubes from the trachea all the way down to the terminal bronchioles really just serve as a conduit for air. They serve as a passageway for air and really nothing else. That's why it's called the conducting zone, because all of these tubes really serve the purpose of conducting air. That's it. But there are differences between the upper portions of the conducting zone and the lower portions that I briefly want to point out. So what you should notice about the trachea, primary, secondary, even tertiary bronchi is that they have these blue rings on them. What those blue rings are is what's called, it's cartilage. It's a type of hyaline cartilage. In the trachea, it's called tracheal cartilage. They're actual C ring-shaped pieces of cartilage that exist all the way down the trachea. If you ever do a dissection, it's really easy to identify the trachea because you can actually see and feel all of these tracheal rings of cartilage that exist. Now, those rings of cartilage continue to exist within the tubes that are the primary, secondary, and to a lesser extent, but still there within the tertiary bronchi. Now, what's the purpose of these rings of cartilage? It's to keep the tubes open. These tubes constantly deal with big changes in pressure, and they very easily have the ability to collapse. You do not want the trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi collapsing. It's very important that they don't collapse. And what these rings of cartilage do is they provide stability to these tubes, and they keep them open and enable them to deal with those pressure changes and prevent them from collapsing. And you'll also notice if you look over here, so it says cartilage, right? There's lots of cartilage within the primary, secondary, and to some degree tertiary bronchi. And there's very little smooth muscle. There's some, but there's not that much, okay? So the tubes of the lungs are lined with smooth muscle, just like our blood vessels are. There's a layer of smooth muscle that exists within these tubes. And that smooth muscle can contract and it can relax. And it does the exact same thing to the lungs, to these tubes within the lungs, that it does to blood vessels. If the smooth muscle contracts, then the lumen, the opening in the center, will become more narrow. If the smooth muscle relaxes, then the lumen, the hollow opening in the center, will become wider. Okay, it's like vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Right? It's really the exact same thing, except it's a passageway for air. It's not a passageway for blood, but the actual dynamics of flow ultimately end up being exactly the same. The point I'm trying to make is these upper passageways, right, within the conducting zone, meaning the trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, they have lots of cartilage and they don't have that much smooth muscle. What that tells you is that these passageways, these tubes, they don't change the size of their lumen very much, right? The hollow opening in the center of the trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi really doesn't change much at all. It doesn't really change ever to any meaningful degree within the trachea. Sometimes if we cough, there can be a little bit of a manipulation, but generally these passageways, the internal opening, the lumen, the hollow opening in the center, it just doesn't narrow and increase in diameter. It doesn't happen very much. However, if you look at the bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, you'll notice that there's no cartilage whatsoever. Right? The cartilage that exists within the trachea, primary, secondary bronchi, it's gone by the time that you get into the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles. And additionally, there's tons of smooth muscle proportionally that lines the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles. So what that tells you about the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles is they're collapsible. They don't have those rings that keep them open. Okay, so they theoretically have the ability and do collapse, which isn't actually that big of a deal, as you'll see as we progress through the next lectures. The big point to make here, though, is the fact that the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles have all this smooth muscle. That tells you that the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles really function like the arterioles. The bronchioles and terminal bronchioles have the ability to change the size the size of their lumen significantly. The bronchioles, if the smooth muscle within the bronchioles contracts, then the bronchioles themselves, the hollow opening in the center, the lumen can narrow significantly. If the smooth muscle relaxes, then the hollow opening in the center of the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles can increase its diameter significantly. And that has a huge influence over the amount of resistance that the air experiences, right? So whether the bronchioles are, constricted or dilated, right? Meaning whether that smooth muscle within the bronchioles is either contracted or relaxed, is going to have a huge influence over how narrow or wide the diameter of the lumen within the bronchioles is. And thus, it will have a huge influence over how much air can flow through these tubes. So the point of all of this is to say that these upper passageways, like the trachea, primary, secondary, bronchi, etc., the hollow opening in the center, the lumen doesn't change all that much. They really just serve as a non-changing passageway for air. But then, once you get down into the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles, the lumen, the hollow opening in the center, can change significantly depending upon whether that smooth muscle is contracted or narrowed. And this will have an influence over how much air we actually bring in and out of our lungs during different circumstances, like during exercise, during relaxation, whether the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system is activated. Okay, so I just want you to keep that in mind for now. It's not the biggest thing in the world at this exact moment, but nonetheless, I do want you to realize that it is true. So before we go any further with these tubes, I need to point out a term because it's relevant to the tubes, and that is external respiration. Anytime that gases are exchanged between two tissues, it's referred to as external respiration. Okay, for example, if gases are exchanged between the lungs and the blood, that is referred to as external respiration, right? It's the exchange of gas between two tissues, okay? So just keep that in mind as we continue to look at the path that that air takes through the lungs. This is a terminal bronchiole. A terminal bronchiole, again, is a bronchiole that has an internal diameter of less than 0.5 millimeters. When terminal bronchioles begin to have these little sacs show up on them, which are called alveoli, they go from being called terminal bronchioles to respiratory bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles and respiratory bronchioles anatomically are really the exact same thing. Okay, they both have internal diameters of less than 0.5 millimeters. The only difference is respiratory bronchioles have these little sacs on them, and terminal bronchioles do not have those little sacs on them. So why all of a sudden do we call them respiratory bronchioles? And the answer is, well, the air that's traveling through the terminal bronchioles and then into these respiratory bronchioles, the air goes into these little sacs called alveoli. And that's where ultimately gas exchange happens. The gases within the air, right? Air is made up of gases, by the way, if that wasn't clear. So the air that goes into these little sacs, right? The gases that make up that air get exchanged with the blood that travels past these little sacs. The point is, gas exchange happens between these sacs and the blood that travels past these little sacs. We call that external respiration. Okay? external respiration happens within these little sacs that exist on these bronchioles. So since external respiration happens within these little sacs, and these little sacs exist on these bronchioles, we now call these bronchioles respiratory bronchioles, because as the air travels through these respiratory bronchioles, it also travels into these little sacs where external respiration, gas exchange occurs. That's where the terminology comes from. You don't want to remember all that. All you've got to remember is when you get to the level of a bronchiole that has alveoli, these little sacs located on them, they're no longer called terminal bronchioles, they're called respiratory bronchioles, because basically external respiration, gas exchange will begin to happen as air travels through these bronchioles. All right, continuing on. The respiratory bronchioles will ultimately turn into what are called alveolar ducts. And the alveolar ducts lead into these things called alveolar sacs. Okay? An alveolar sac is just a sac of alveoli, right? You can see all these, like an alveolar sac is just a literal sac of usually thousands of alveoli. Okay? Alveoli are, again, each alveolus, right? This is one alveolus right here, singular. Okay? If you take one alveolus and you combine it with a whole bunch of other ones, right? What we would call that is an alveolar sac, right? It's now a sac of alveoli. Alveoli is plural, right? There's a ton of them all together. And what I'm saying is these terminal bronchioles lead in to these alveolar sacs, right? A terminal bronchiole becomes a respiratory bronchiole becomes a alveolar duct, and the alveolar duct leads into the alveolar sac. So I got slightly jumbled at the end there, and I want to do this one time with 100% accuracy. The air is going to travel through terminal bronchioles. Once the terminal bronchioles have alveoli, these little sacs show up on them, we no longer call them terminal bronchioles, we call them respiratory bronchioles, because external respiration happens at the level of the alveoli. Okay, so air travels through the terminal bronchioles, and then once alveoli show up on the bronchioles, we call them respiratory bronchioles. So now air is traveling through respiratory bronchioles. Respiratory bronchioles will turn into what are called alveolar ducts. Alveolar ducts are just passageways into the alveolar sacs, and the alveolar sacs are just made up of clusters of alveoli, right? A whole bunch of those sacs all collectively together. An alveolar sac is just made up of hundreds or thousands of alveoli. So where does this air that we breathe in from the atmosphere ultimately end up mostly? The air, the terminal location for the air is within the alveolar sacs. That's where the air from the atmosphere ultimately ends up. It ends up in these alveolar sacs, and an even better way of saying this is the air ends up within the alveoli, because the alveoli make up the alveolar sacs. The air from the atmosphere ends up in all of these little sacs where gas exchange, or external respiration as it's called, is going to occur. Where we want to get the air from the atmosphere is ultimately into our alveoli, right? We want to get the air into these alveolar sacs, and we want to get the air into these individual little sacs, which are called alveoli. Okay. Now, why do we want to do that? Look at what covers the alveoli. Pulmonary capillaries. Pulmonary capillaries surround the alveoli. They actually exist on the surface of the alveoli themselves. And what does that mean exactly? What have you gotten into these alveoli air from the atmosphere, right? Air came from the atmosphere, it traveled into the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, through the glottis, into the larynx, down into the trachea, through the primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, down into the bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and ultimately into the alveolar sacs, which means that the air ends up in these alveoli. And now you've got the air in these alveoli, and the alveoli are surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. And you might ask, where do pulmonary capillaries come from? Because this is an image clearly of an alveolar sac, right? What's an alveolar sac made up of? All the individual alveoli. Okay. What's surrounding all of the alveoli? These pulmonary capillaries. Where are they coming from? What forms capillaries? Well, arterioles, right? Arteries become arterioles, and then arterioles become capillary beds, and then capillary beds become venules, and venules become veins. Okay, so think about it. The right ventricle contracts, and then the right ventricle contracts, and it pushes deoxygenated blood into ultimately the pulmonary arteries. And then the pulmonary arteries will become these right here, which are pulmonary arterioles. And the pulmonary arterioles are carrying deoxygenated blood, blood that is poor in oxygen and rich in carbon dioxide. And then the pulmonary arterioles are going to form the capillaries that surround the alveoli. Right? These are pulmonary capillaries formed from the pulmonary arterioles. So this is carrying deoxygenated blood to the alveoli. And then what's going to happen is there's going to be an exchange of gases, right? The carbon dioxide that exists in the blood in the pulmonary capillaries is going to go into the alveoli. And the oxygen that just came in with the air, right? Because the air is made up of, you're going to see 21% oxygen. So the air that just came in to the alveolar sac, and thus the alveoli, has lots of oxygen within it. And then what's going to happen is the oxygen from the air is going to move into the blood within the pulmonary capillaries. So what happens here is the blood gets oxygenated at the lungs, right? The blood travels through the pulmonary capillaries, and the pulmonary capillaries travel past these alveoli. And as the blood travels through the pulmonary capillaries past the alveoli, what happens is oxygen from the air in the alveoli, which just came from the atmosphere, the oxygen goes into the blood. And the carbon dioxide that's within the blood, the waste product, goes into the alveoli. There was an exchange of gases here. And now what have we created? We've created oxygenated blood. Blood that is rich in oxygen, poor in carbon dioxide. And that oxygenated blood is now going to enter into, right here, the pulmonary venules and ultimately the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins will take the oxygenated blood, blood that's rich in oxygen, poor in carbon dioxide, back to the left atrium. Okay? And then the left atrium, the blood will go into the left ventricle, and then it'll be pumped back out into the aorta or systemic circuit. This is why we need to get air from the atmosphere into ultimately our alveoli. Because what we want is we want the oxygen that is within the air to makes up a portion of the air, right? Oxygen makes up 21% of the air. Okay? So we want the oxygen that is within and makes up the air to end up in our alveoli. And then we want the oxygen to go into the blood that exists in the pulmonary capillaries so the blood can become reoxygenated. And at the same time, we want that waste product that's within the blood called carbon dioxide to go into the sacs. We want it to go into the alveoli. And then what will happen is the carbon dioxide that is now within the alveoli will be exhaled. It'll be blown off, right, out of the lungs and back out into the atmosphere for the plants. And now once the blood has gone through the pulmonary capillaries, right, once the blood has gone through the pulmonary capillaries, the blood will now enter into the pulmonary veins as oxygenated blood, and the pulmonary veins will take the blood back to the left side of the heart. This is a little bit more detailed image. This is a little bit more of a detailed image, excuse me, of one alveolus, right? One alveolus, singular, right? So we're just looking at one, and we're looking at it internally. Okay, so we've kind of cross-cut it, and we're looking inside of one alveolus, right? Alveoli, plural, means you're talking about many of them. This is just one alveolus, singular, right? One of the sacs, that's it. And what do you notice about the alveolus? Well, from the last image, it should make sense. The alveolus is surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. That's what those are. The pulmonary capillaries surround the alveoli. In this case, we're showing the pulmonary capillaries surrounding one alveolus. And what is within the alveolus? Well, there's a bunch of oxygen in the alveolus that came from the atmosphere. Oxygen from the atmosphere, within the air that makes up the air, ended up in this alveolus. And where does the oxygen go? Well, it goes into the blood within these pulmonary capillaries. At the same time, what happens? The carbon dioxide, the CO2 that is within the blood in these pulmonary capillaries, it goes into the alveolus. Right? The carbon dioxide goes from the blood into the air in the alveolus, and then we blow that air, which is now rich in carbon dioxide, off into the atmosphere through exhalation. This is gas exchange. This is external respiration, the exchange of gas between two tissues. Now, I wanted to point out one more thing about the anatomy of these alveoli. The alveoli, in this case, we're looking at one alveolus, but you can imagine this applies to all of them. So the alveoli are all surrounded by a layer of simple squamous epithelium. Really, alveoli, the sacs, are just made up of simple squamous epithelium. They're really just a layer of simple squamous. You know how blood vessels are lined by the tunica intima, which is just a layer of simple squamous epithelium that we call the endothelium? Alveoli, these sacs, are really kind of the same thing. They don't have a tunica media, meaning they don't have smooth muscle that surrounds them. But the internal portion of the alveoli is just made up of a layer of simple squamous epithelium, just like a blood vessel is. Maybe it would absolutely be most fair to compare the alveoli to capillaries, right? Capillaries are just a layer of simple squamous epithelium and then a basement membrane. You can actually see that here, right? Capillaries are just a layer of simple squamous epithelial cells, and then a basement membrane. And alveoli are exactly the same. Now, obviously, gas, air, exists within alveoli, and blood exists within a capillary, but they're structurally quite similar in the sense that both capillaries and alveoli are lined, all they're really made up of is a layer of simple squamous epithelium. When we talk about the alveolus, or the alveoli, the epithelial cells that make up and line the alveoli are mostly what are called type 1 alveolar cells. But we also find interspaced between the type 1 alveolar cells, you can see them in green here, what are called type 2 alveolar cells. In yellow are the type 1, right? Those are the most common. They're a type of epithelial cell. But then we also have these type 2 alveolar cells, which are also a type of epithelial cell, but they serve a very different purpose. Okay? Let's make sure that I'm being as clear as possible. Alveoli are really made up and lined by a layer of simple squamous epithelium. Most of the epithelial cells that make up that layer of simple squamous epithelium are type 1 alveolar cells. But there are also some type 2 alveolar cells, which are interspaced throughout there, and they're depicted here in green. And these type 2 alveolar cells are going to produce something that's called surfactant, which is going to become incredibly important when we start discussing pulmonary ventilation in more detail, the process of getting air in and out of the lungs. Because what this surfactant is going to do is it's going to allow for these alveoli to overcome something which is called surface tension. And if you weren't able to overcome that, you wouldn't be able to breathe. So these little cells that you see highlighted in green, which again are a type of epithelial cell, they're much less common to see within the alveoli, but incredibly important. They produce an incredibly important molecule that we will discuss later on. I spent so much time talking about the importance of the type 2 alveolar cells that I think I neglected telling you the importance of the type 1 alveolar cells. So the type 1 alveolar cells, depicted in yellow, right, the most common type of alveolar cell that there is, the type 1 alveolar cells, they're what really form the alveoli. I mean, they are what structurally make up these sacs, right? The alveoli themselves are formed by the type 1 alveolar cells. And also, very importantly, they serve as a barrier between the gases that exist within the air in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. So the type 1 alveolar cells do serve also as an important barrier between the gases that exist in the air in the alveoli and within the blood in the capillaries. So anyways, moving on. So this concludes the first introductory lecture. The purpose of this lecture was to begin the process of talking about pulmonary ventilation, how air gets in and out of the lungs. To begin that process, what I wanted to do was show you the anatomical path that air takes from the atmosphere into our lungs. Okay, so I showed you the path that air takes from the atmosphere into our lungs. Air ultimately ends up traveling from the atmosphere into the alveoli within the lungs. That's the purpose of bringing the air in. You want the air to get from the atmosphere into the alveoli. Why do you want this air to end up in the alveoli? Because you want gas exchange to happen. Okay? You want oxygen to move from the air into the blood within the pulmonary capillaries that surrounds the alveoli. And you want carbon dioxide to move from the blood in the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. And then what happens after that gas exchange process occurs? You blow the air back out, okay, to get the carbon dioxide out. The purpose of inhalation really is to get oxygen from the atmosphere down into the alveoli so that it can go into the blood. The purpose of exhaling really is to get the carbon dioxide that is now within the air in the alveoli, which came from the blood, back out into the atmosphere. The whole process of getting air into and then back out of the lungs is called pulmonary ventilation. Now you've seen the path and a little bit of the reason as to why this air comes in and out of our lungs. But in the next lecture, we need to talk about mechanically, physiologically, how the air actually gets pulled in and then back out of the lungs. And then after we're done talking about that, after we're done finishing the discussion of pulmonary ventilation, then we'll delve much deeper into gas exchange, because that process by which oxygen moves from the air into the blood and by which carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the air within the alveoli, that is also far more complicated than I made it out to sound, or how it looks, right? It looks like a relatively simple process, but it is incredibly complicated, the process of gas exchange. Okay, so that's the sequence of events that are coming.